all lovers of film and of film history will welcome this reconstruction of Waxworks, a Ufa production of 1924. In fact, it's amazing to realise that a lot of the most famous writings on this film that I will be talking about in the course of this commentary were written by people who saw the film in 1924, probably, German scholars who were seeing the film and writing about it, writing about their memory of it, and perhaps also seeing the sort of successively degraded prints of the film that have circulated ever since. At the outset, I would like to dedicate this commentary to Thomas Elsässer, who died in December 2019 at the age of 76, and I'll be referring to his book on Weimar and Expressionist cinema in the course of this commentary. But what I'd like to begin with is a quotation from Paul Leni, the director of the film. In regards to the entire look and design of the movie, Leni said, "If the designer merely imitated photography to construct his sets, the film would remain faceless and impersonal. There has to be the possibility of bringing out an object's essential attributes so as to give the image style and colour. This is particularly necessary for films set entirely in a world of unreality. For my film Waxworks, I have tried to create sets so stylised that they evince no idea of reality. My fairground is sketched in with an utter renunciation of detail. All it seeks to engender is an indescribable fluidity of light, moving shapes, shadows, lines and curves. It is not extreme reality that the camera perceives, but the reality of the interior event, which is more profound, effective and moving than what we see through everyday eyes. And I equally believe that the cinema can reproduce this truth, heightened effectively." Well, one of the first things you learn from that quotation is how deeply Leni was involved with the entire conception and construction of this film. Like every aspect of the visual design was part of the direction. Now, before we go any further, let's say something about the basic plot concept of the film. So, the poet, played by Wilhelm Dietler, later William Dietler in Hollywood. The poet, presumably maybe down on his luck looking for work, comes into this booth, fairground, circus booth of the Waxworks. And he is asked, "Can you write these startling tales to accompany these figures?" Now, look carefully at what happens here, because we have an introduction to the main characters, Spring-Heeled Jack, who is we know better as Jack the Ripper, and we also have the introduction to the actors, because of course it's the actors, Werner Krauss, Emil Jannings, Conrad Veidt, who are actually standing here. There are no Waxworks. But look at this guy. There is some discussion of a second figure, but there's no intertitle. Now, that second figure was going to be Rinaldo Rinaldini, an Italian robber, hero, bandit, kind of like a Robin Hood figure. However, his story is not in the film. It was in the script of the film, written by Henrik Galeen, who worked on Nosferatu and The Golem and other films we'll mention later. The story of Rinaldini was written, but it was decided not to go ahead and film it finally because they ran out of money. So they didn't remake this scene, so there's the trace of Rinaldini in it. And if that segment had been filmed, it would have been in fact Dietler, this star who is the poet here. Dietler would have morphed into that character. We don't know who the actor was who was standing in as Rinaldini there. So, we've already got the introduction to an intrigue or a premise, a narrative premise, which will be bringing the Waxworks to life, telling the stories, kind of imaginary, fanciful stories about these various figures. Let's just note as we go through that the English title, Waxworks, is a perfectly elegant condensation of the longer German title, which means the Cabinet of the Wax Figures. Now, of course, in English, waxworks refer to both the wax figures themselves and the place, the venue, the booth in the fairground, whatever, the waxworks, like we'd say, the theatre works or whatever. And so waxworks is a great condensation of the meanings of that. However, the Cabinet of the Wax Figures has a reference to, of course, a classic which was only 5 years before this film in the history of German cinema, which is the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And I'll be returning to this at various points, because this film, of course, stands in some relation to that film, particularly in the history of what we know as German Expressionism, or more widely, a part of Weimar cinema. If we think of Expressionist cinema in Germany as something that goes roughly between 1919 and 1924, and Weimar, the political period of Weimar in Germany, is 1918 to 1933, so through to, of course, the birth and development of Nazism. Now, I think it's very important with this film, Waxworks, not to smother it with those very large and very written about historical contexts. It would be a mistake to see everything in the film as simply an illustration or an example or as a result of either or both Expressionist cinema, in whatever sense you will define that, and we'll talk about its definition, or the era of the Weimar Republic. The film is also its own thing, meaning it's an inventive film, it's a very stylised film. In referring to the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, there's a sense that it's in a dialogue with the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, even in some sense that it's a parody or a bit of a laugh about that film. And this is an important aspect of the way we interpret Waxworks. I'll come back to it, because some commentators stress the dark Gothic aspects, the horrific aspects. Other commentators stress this comedy aspect. Now, for instance, one of the most revered commentators on this film is the German writer Siegfried Kracauer, who left Germany and relocated himself in America. And it was in America that he wrote his famous book of the late 1940s, From Caligari to Hitler. That's a very important book, and I'll be referring to it in various ways as we go through. Now, for Kracauer, just to say this straight away, Kracauer did not like this first story of the film, the story of the Caliph of Bagdad, Harun al-Rashid, because basically he found it too flippant. He thought it was a fairly superficial prelude to the rest of the film, which was more serious in tone. Indeed, it is more serious in tone, the rest of the film. But however, it would be wrong to think of this episode that we're now in as a prelude, because in fact it is the longest episode. If you put it together with the framing story, that is to say the introduction with the poet and the guy who runs the booth and the daughter, it runs for some 40 minutes of the film. So it's not as insignificant, that's the word that Kracauer used, it's not as insignificant as Kracauer thought. It does introduce the central theme on which we will have a number of variations. And in some ways what I take that theme to be is not necessarily themes of evil, power, or violence. These things are all aspects of the film too, and we'll address them. But it's to do, in a way, with storytelling, with the different media of storytelling, oral storytelling, visual storytelling, photographic storytelling, and so on. The film, through the idea of the waxwork, of bringing the waxwork to life, and then spinning a story from that. This is really what the film is about. It's about this fanciful process of transforming, as it were, raw material of a waxwork into a story. And there are different ways that it happens. Now I want you to look at this detail. There was the guy sharpening his sword, and then we cut to the figure of the poet sort of kneading his bread. He's a baker. So now this is something that another major commentator on the film, Lotte Eisner, a German scholar who eventually had a lot to do with the Cinémathèque in France. She was a close colleague of Henri Langlois, to whom we'll return, because he also wrote very interesting things about this film. Anyway, in Eisner's book, now she also wrote a classic book, The Haunted Screen, which is about German Expressionism, which she wrote originally in the early 1950s in France. She refers to that very precise detail, that rhythmic matching of the sharpening of the sword and of the poet's hands moving the bread, as one of the many examples of rhythm, of playing with rhythm, of joining different gestures, different movements, and different shots. Something we'll come back to is the whole debate that has accrued to this film and other films of the period about how theatrical or how cinematic they are. Expressionism as an art movement took a lot from theatre. Expressionist theatre was a true movement, and Paul Leni was very intimately involved with it, not just the actual making of sets and so on, but also the theorising, the talking, the critical writing about what is expressionism, and also the bigger question of, where should the theatre be going, what should the theatre be. And basically, in this period leading up to expressionist films, there was a big movement to stylise the theatre around questions of design, of costume, of lighting. We'll get into this in more detail as we go through. From my point of view, what I find fascinating about Waxworks is that you can see this theatricality, you can see these sorts of vistas of incredible sets and of the actors sort of positioned like waxworks in a set. And you can see the traces of what has been called theatrical expressionism. But there's also a very important set of moves on Leni's part as a director to make that as cinematic as possible. And one of the ways that happens is through the cutting. So, for instance, we've gone from this wide shot of the outside of this incredible building here, incredible stylised building, itself an incredible expressionist vision. But then we cut into this angle below the window where the baker's wife, played by Olga Belayev, where she, in fact, spends her entire time inside. Interesting gender roles in this film. And so she's completely inside. But those angles sort of below the window, where we see the different reactions of different characters, we see the vizier, the main assistant of the Caliph. We see him looking at the wife. We see the distraught, angry reaction of the baker. Okay, all of that is getting played out in a way it's a sort of a move towards cinema more than the proscenium arch view of a theatre stage. And one of the most important things about this movie is the way in which we see a language of cinema developing, a particular language of cinema, using ideas from theatre, aesthetic ideas from theatre, but also making them more and more cinematic. It's fascinating when you look at the way the shots move from one to the other. Now, we're not yet in a period where at least a filmmaker such as Leni is using what would later be the basic Hollywood language of shot, reverse shot, of, over the shoulder of one character and then the other as they speak. There's something still There's still something sort of frontal about the shots, the camera taking a frontal position, but there are variations on that. For instance, we've seen the shot of the baker's wife looking into the mirror, as it were, the piece of glass that reflects her, and that was a more unusual shot. In fact, there are a lot of unusual shots in this film. Unusual angles, unusual vantage points from within a scene. So in this space, in this amazing sort of cave-like space here, there are shots that seem to be from the viewpoint of where the window is. There are all kinds of different plays on how you render a space that's getting away, as I say, advancing from a purely kind of frontal theatrical view. Okay, now the Caliph is played by one of the greatest German actors of the period, Emil Jannings, and he was in The Blue Angel. He's in many great films, The Last Command. He worked with Joseph von Sternberg, with many others. Emil Jannings is really having a whale of a time here. I would also tell you that Olga Belayev, also known as Olga von Belayev, she in a lesser register is also playing, I think, in a somewhat camp way, in a very self-conscious sort of winking kind of way. We'll come back to that because I think this is part of the playfulness of the entire film. It's also part of the debt that this film has, that Waxworks has, to the films of Ernst Lubitsch. Because if Waxworks has a lot to do with German Expressionism, it also has a lot to do with the comedies, the exotic historical comedies of Ernst Lubitsch in this period, before this period, and even later in Hollywood when he would do a variation on this style of the historical exotic comedy. But in this period, the German period of Ernst Lubitsch's work, we have a very, very camp sense of playing with stereotypes, of the actors having fun with their roles, and so on. Now, I've mentioned Lotte Eisner in her book The Haunted Screen, and I want to quote for you a little from the chapter of her book, which is called Decorative Expressionism. So, to do with decor, with sets, and so on. And there's a section of this part of her book called The Concept of Space, and she's talking about the sets, the costumes, so the overall design of this episode of Waxworks. And she says, the puffy, dough-like settings in the episode of The Baker's Wife are full of rotundities, so round shapes and cockled walls, and the space seems to have no interior framing. The corridors, staircases, and the soft, yielding arches seem to anticipate the creations of Antonio Gaudí. These sets are skillfully matched to the bloated physique of Emil Jannings, whose face is depersonalised by a coarse makeup. Tricked out in an immense turban, his clothes padded and looking like some huge spinning top, his Harun al-Rashid trundles his belly around a studio orient. That's great, a studio orient. So this is a very Lubitsch type thing, right? It's the completely artificial, completely avowedly cliche-ridden image of the Orient, which, many years later, people would write about Orientalism, like these fantasy projections of this part of the world and its cultures. However, Orientalism also has a comic side, the playful side, and you see it full bore happening in Waxworks. Indeed, Siegfried Kracauer himself, even though he wasn't a big fan of this part of the film, really the first half of the film, I think he very accurately described the character, the figure of the Caliph, when he said, he is an oriental burlesque, ridiculing the manner of tyrants. The kind of tyrant who makes passes at every pretty woman, In a fit of temper, they order innocent people beheaded, and a moment later magnanimously pardon unpardonable crimes. And so there you have a sort of a comic variation on the powerful figure who Krakauer calls a tyrant. We'll come back to Krakauer's theory of what he calls the imaginary tyrant in this period of German cinema. But the point I would like to introduce now is a point I borrow from David Bordwell. And Bordwell has suggested, quite rightly I think, that Waxworks belongs to two strands of film history, and in a way two strands of film historian, two different kinds of film historian. On the one hand, the film belongs in the very elaborate history of people who have wanted to assert and prove and demonstrate that film is an art, and that the art of cinema, the history of art cinema, or cinema as an art, can be written, particularly with these national milestones. And many of us will be very familiar, perhaps too familiar, with the kinds of survey courses and history books that proceed through German Expressionism, Italian Neorealism, French New Wave, New German Cinema, and so on and so forth, right? So Waxworks, as a German Expressionist film, if we peg it to that movement, becomes part of a series of claims, of assertions, of arguments about, well, what is film art? And what constitutes film art? And how does this film measure up to that? What advances does it make in the development of film art? Now, there's another strand of film history that Bordwell correctly identifies, and really it's more to do with horror fans of horror cinema, buffs, experts, historians of horror cinema, from at the very least the 1950s to our day now. And for them, Waxworks sits in a different historical line. Of course, part of German Expressionism, but Waxworks is more important, firstly as a film that uses different motifs of the Gothic story, of fantasy, of the dark fairy tale and so on, but particularly because it is an omnibus film. So to the horror historians, the film is important because, firstly because it introduces the key motif of Waxworks, and there's a whole line of horror films that use the idea of the waxwork in various ways. But it has this omnibus anthology episodic form in which we have a series of stories and we have some kind of framing story, usually at the start, the end, and in between each episode, that can serve many functions. Framing stories can do lots of things in different kinds of films. On the one hand, they can have a very sort of comforting, reassuring aspect to make light of, to explain the strange things that are happening, to reach a good moral resolution at the end, to deliver a lesson and so on. On the other hand, of course, there are omnibus films where the framing story sort of serves to make what may already be disturbing or disquieting even more so. And one of the classics there is the British film Dead of Night, one of these omnibus films where people gather at a house, everyone tells a story and so on. So you can see Waxworks in that tradition as well. But I'm going to return to the various accounts of German Expressionism and also the wider context of Weimar cinema, just to give you some sense of the kinds of frameworks in which Waxworks has been placed. And here I'm going to refer to Thomas Elsasser's book, Weimar Cinema and After, Germany's Historical Imaginary. And this idea of a historical imaginary is Elsasser's attempt to reformulate the kind of idea we see very strongly in Krakauer and a little less so in Lotte Eisner, this idea that films, these German films, sort of directly mirrored the collective mind of the German people. And Krakauer's argument, famous argument, is that in fact these films, German Expressionist films, were a kind of premonition of Nazism. They were responding to, as it were, the collapse of the German people, the German state, after the end of World War One. Various fears, various possibilities, various nightmares go around, and German Expressionism expresses these nightmares, according to Krakauer, and they also give a sign of a rather horrifying future. And Krakauer is referring across the board there to figures like Dr. Mabuse, Nosferatu, Caligari, the Golem, like all the different figures of that have been associated with German Expressionist cinema. So let me refer to Elsas's book here. So he has a series of attempts to kind of to define or to place what is the popular idea, what is the popular conception or definition of Expressionism. And first he begins with this list. He says that what has been identified as Expressionism in film is unusual lighting, stylisation of sets and acting, the Gothic story material and the fairy tale motifs, angular exteriors, claustrophobic interiors, and we've certainly seen plenty of them here in this film already. Referring to Siegfried Krakauer, Elsasser says that Krakauer focused on figures like madmen, machine men, tyrants, supermen, and charlatans. A little later in his book, Elsasser says he refers to the by now almost inevitable associations of Expressionism, which he lists as terrifying doubles, mysterious strangers, Faustian pacts and deadly wagers, idyllic towns visited by stern figures dressed in black, gingerbread houses dwarfed by giant skyscrapers, and cities peopled by deadly despots wearing white gloves or hiding mad scientists with piercing eyes. So there, Elsasser is referring to not only the imagery that comes from the films themselves, but also the whole range of interpretations, and often very Gothic interpretations of the films. Elsasser also cites the work of Kristen Thompson, and in her book on Ivan the Terrible, the Eisenstein's film, Ivan the Terrible, of course, Ivan the Terrible is going to be a character in the next episode of this film. But in her book, Kristen Thompson tries to give a more limited and a more style-related, more aesthetic, formal definition of Expressionism, which is kind of more manageable and more workable and can be used on other films, such as the Russian film by Eisenstein. So this is Kristen Thompson. Expressionism will here serve as a stylistic term applying to a general attempt to minimise the differences among the four aspects of mise-en-scène. And those four aspects are lighting, costume, figure disposition and behaviour, and setting. So lighting, costume, figure disposition and behaviour, and setting. The Expressionist film makes, as much as possible, a single visual material of these aspects. The result is an emphasis on overall composition. And this is very important in her definition. Expressionism lends the expressivity of the human body to the entire visual field, right, to the entire frame, while simultaneously trying to make of the body a purely compositional element. So it's trying to take the expressive work of the body and to extend it to everything, so the lights, the set, the costumes. But it also makes the body, the human figure itself, just one element within the entire frame, the entire composition. Now that's very important, that's good, because that sort of focuses us on sort of the material work of Paul Leni in this film, who indeed was striving for all of the things that Thompson has defined in that quoted passage. This total fusion of lighting, costume, disposition and behaviour of figures, and setting. There's another distinction which David Bordwell has mentioned, and it comes from Henri Langlois, a French cinematheque who gave many, many lectures about film history. Some of his writings on that have been collected. And also from another film historian, Jean Mitry. And Mitry and Langlois both stressed that there's sort of two sides of this expressionist style or expressionist aesthetic. On the one hand, there's a kind of a two-dimensional, a flat surface of the frame, kind of like a painting or a drawing. And then there's also volumetric expressionism, in other words, where we have space, where we have the depth of space, we have movement from foreground to background. So we have the volumetric aspects of space introduced into the two dimensions, as it were, become three dimensions of volume. And once again, we can see Leni playing with both things. And when I say there are these moves from the theatrical to the cinematic, quite literally there, he's taken everything that he's learnt and developed with Max Reinhardt, the great pioneer of expressionist theatre, and a lot of that had to do with the overall image, the sort of flat image, for instance, on the stage. But then also trying to deal with the volumetric aspects of space, of movement, of changing angles, of having of having characters enter and exit the frame. And there's some beautiful examples of that in this film, Waxworks. So let's keep that aesthetic definition in mind and not sort of zoom off too fast to talking about German history and the German soul and things that sometimes get a little heavy in the writings about this film, including in Krakow and to some extent in Eisner, because both of those great historians were sort of looking for a big abstraction, a big sort of cause in history itself to lend, in a way, a depth to the films, a meaning to the films. Eisner was more of an art historian. That was more her focus, was the aesthetics of art history. But still, her very title, The Haunted Screen, tells you that finally there is a sort of a dark and gothic interpretation. How could there not be after the Second World War and after the concentration camps? And remember, it's that period after that both Krakauer and Eisner wrote their books. I want you to note in passing here a very important aspect of Leni's whole aesthetic concept for this film, which has to do with sort of horizontal and vertical. Now you might say, well, every film's got horizontal and vertical in it, but Leni really does things like this incredible vertical movements, and we'll see this taken even further in the next episode, the Ivan the Terrible episode, where almost the entire place, the entire space seems to have been rendered as a sort of great sort of vertical line, sort of along a staircase, points plotted along a staircase. And we have, as it were, the preview here, where the baker is fleeing, trying to escape, rather vainly trying to escape by climbing to the top of this amazing construction here, this amazing building, from which he's going to sort of launch himself and do a stunt that's worthy of Mad Max Fury Road, to get onto a tree there and bring himself to the ground. And, as you watch this sort of fantastic moment of, vertical battle here, it's also a premonition of King Kong, in cinema history. These great battles atop towers and turrets and so on. One theme that I'd like to return to is what I began to say about the central theme or theme and variations, the central premise of the film in terms of what it's about. Now, in a lot of the writing on expressionist cinema, whether it's Krakauer or Eisner or Elsesser, you'll read a lot about the theme of doubling, doubles, doppelgangers, where people, confront their mirror image, or they're doubled in some way, and so on. And Waxworks I see as a very ingenious and, once again, sort of playful, sometimes humorous set of variations on the idea of doubling, in the sense that if I turn a waxwork, a still figure, into a story, I'm doubling that figure. And this film goes through a series of variations on that. Like, firstly, the poet sits down to write a story of a baker. And then, as it were, he and also the proprietor's daughter project themselves into that story. They become those characters acting in that story. So that's already one form of doubling, of making a double of yourself within a fiction. Now, within this tale that we're watching now of the baker, now the whole story, as of course was set up at the start, is all premised on the question of the arm, the kind of disembodied arm of the Caliph. And of course, in reality, as it were, the reality of the Waxworks booth, that is, of course, a part of a waxwork that has fallen off somehow. Then that is transformed into this whole comedy of identity, mistaken identity and misperception, where the baker thinks he is cutting off the arm of Harun, and in fact he's cutting off the arm of a doll, of a life-size doll replica that has been placed in the bed and so on, so that the Caliph can do his nightly stalking of presumably the local women. And so there is another kind of doubling, right? You double yourself by making a figure of yourself. That's what the Caliph does. Later in the film, we'll have yet other versions of this doubling. The very idea that the film itself uses is that you don't show a waxwork, you show an actor. Jannings, Veit, Kraus, you show them sort of standing there, trembling a little bit, as the waxwork. So you've already doubled the waxwork as an actor. It's already a good sign as to the type of artifice and playfulness that the film will be involved in. And then finally, in the final episode, the Jack the Ripper episode, we have another variation again, which is dreams. So it's not reverie, it's not I imagine a story and I imagine I am the hero of that story, which the poet does, casts himself as a baker, the daughter casts herself as the wife of the baker. In the episode that was not shot, the poet would imagine himself as Rinaldo Rinaldini. So that's like a reverie where you project yourself, you double yourself into the story. But the final episode is about dreams. Of course, remember, Freud and Freudian theory was very much in the air at this time, although it had already been for a quarter of a century almost by the time this film was made. And so dreams had already become a very standard sort of not only topic of popular thought and discussion, but also a plot device. And the idea of that in dreams you have a fantasy, a nightmare that expresses certain anxieties or certain hopes and desires in your life. This gets played out in a very, very fast, very condensed way in the short final episode of the film. So we have here the concept of doubling. We also have another idea that comes up a lot in writings on German Expressionism, which is the uncanny. Now, the uncanny is also a Freudian concept, but it also has a more general and even everyday sense. We talk about the uncanny as things being a little disturbed, a little strange, a little out of kilter. And of course, for instance, the cinema of David Lynch is completely dedicated to the mood, to the feeling, the effect of uncanniness. Now, the uncanny also refers to this sort of blurred border between, for instance, dream and reality, and also between something original and its copy. So between a waxwork and a living figure that comes to life, there's a sort of an uncanny frisson there, something unusual in that metamorphosis of a waxwork into a person. And in the exchange, the sort of confused exchange between a figure in bed, like the fake Caliph in bed that is attacked with a sword, and of course the real Caliph. So there's this like blurring of the roles, particularly between, as I say, between the original and its copy, something real and its reproduction, or something real and the story that is spun from it, about it. Now this seems to me the realm, the sort of philosophical and aesthetic realm that Leni was in. You know, I get a strong sense that this interested him, and in the final episode, when we reach it, we'll see that really what creates the effect of the uncanny is photography itself, photography and cinematography. It's no longer a psychological thing necessarily. It's not necessarily a Freudian matter of repressed desires or hatreds or whatever it may be. It's something more to do with media and with the medium of film and of photography itself. This is a point that Elsass stresses in his book, that we must never forget the changing history of technology and how different technologies and different media were sort of feeding into people's everyday lives, giving them new fantasies, new fun, new problems, new alienations sometimes. And that the German Expressionist films, even if they're sometimes set in a distant past, the kind of thing we're seeing now, or a totally fantasised, exotic, orientalist world, they're nonetheless reflecting on and certainly using these changing technologies of vision, these technologies of storytelling, technologies of the imagination. And this is a little what Elsass means by the historical imaginary. Now, I just want to say a little more again about the actor here, Olga Belayev, also known, as I mentioned, as Olga von Belayev, as Olga Dog. She was born Russian, and essentially her career runs from 1918 to 1929. She worked in Germany and Denmark. Her career, unfortunately, effectively ended with the coming of sound, which of course is a familiar story for many actors from this silent period. As I mentioned before, there's a fascinating modern element, and this is once again a very Ernst Lubitsch touch. There's a very kind of modern element in her acting, almost like she's, some modern flapper in the midst of this historic tale. And the sort of looks she gives, the reactions she gives, when she's objecting to being basically a housewife kept indoors. I want to have fun, I want to see people. There's a very modern aspect there that's very comical. Now, I mentioned before the idea of resolution. And this is so funny because the Caliph there, Emil Jannings, has one of his great moments because he kind of resolves all of the problems of the story by embracing the baker and his wife, but he's also rolling his eyes like, oh God, do I have to pretend to be a good guy and not, someone who's running around stalking women? And so that's an example of this kind of ironic humour that fills the film at various points. Now we go somewhere else and look at this variation on the original and its copy, and the uncanny media, the uncanny technology. We've got this whole thing with Ivan the Terrible and as a wind-up mechanism, which, as you'll see, has a very strong reference inside the story that we're about to see of Ivan. This idea of a mechanical repetition, right? This is one of the sort of imaginary ideas that comes from changing technology. The wind-up doll, the mechanical person, the machine man, as Elsass referred to it. And it's intriguing that the the Ivan the Terrible story begins with that demonstration of the mechanical man, the machine man. It's another variation on the uncanny. Now, once we enter this story, and in the colour tinting that has been adapted by the restorers and reconstructors of this version, we change colour tone, the tint, to get into the story. And straight away, I mean, anyone who knows anything about film history is thinking about Eisenstein and his film Ivan the Terrible, which of course was made, much later than this film, made in the 40s. And in fact, Eisenstein was a student of German cinema. He saw the films, he wrote about them, he celebrated them, and there's no question that Eisenstein was getting some very direct influences here from this episode of Leni's Waxworks. Because remember what Kristen Thompson said about the entire visual image, the entire visual field, the composition takes on the expressivity of the body, so we have angular sets and so on. And in the same way, the body is kind of sculpted, shaped, drawn, as it were, to fit into the image. And in that sight that we had of Ivan and his associate kind of inching their way along as they're stooped, I mean, that's something that very directly you can see the trace of that in many, many parts of Eisenstein's Ivan the Terrible film. Now, once again, I'd like to quote Lotte Eisner on this, because she's very perceptive about it. She says, "The Ivan the Terrible episode is set entirely in a misty chiaroscuro. Specks of dust float in pools of light, and there is a new impressionism, softening the harshness of expressionist contrast." So an impressionism, in that impressionist cinema, as in French impressionist cinema, particularly impressionist cinema rather than impressionist painting, we have a lot of emphasis on this, on mist, on fog, also on subjective visions of characters who are seeing blurred, who are seeing mist through misty eyes and so on. It's an important part of cinematic impressionism. So we have this mixture. Eisner goes on, "Out of the half-light emerges an ornamental beam, a door, an icon, and suddenly there looms up the glinting shell of a ceremonial bed." She was a really terrific writer, Lotte Eisner, and her evocations, which often combine details from many different scenes in order to get a sort of an overall gestalt, an overall picture of the aesthetic of a film. She did that superbly, as she does here. Another likely influence of this film is on Joseph von Sternberg. Of course, he was someone who had been, mixing with some of these filmmakers, and of course his film The Blue Angel was made in Germany. But particularly Sternberg's film The Scarlet Empress seems to have some traces of Waxworks in it. And indeed, listen to Krakauer's description. He says, "One shot in the Ivan episode reveals the magic spell power radiates. Ivan appears in a folding door, the portrait of a saint in life-size on each leaf, and as he stands there, vested with all the insignia of his dignity, he seems a living icon between the two painted ones." Krakauer refers to that as a picture unit, like a very strong image, and indeed there are very similar images and ideas, visual, conceptual, architectural ideas in The Scarlet Empress by Sternberg. Let's say a little more about the career of Paul Leni. A sadly short career. He died at the age of 44 in 1929. He started early, at least. Already in his teen years, at the age of 15 and 16, he was known as an avant-garde painter. But his main work was in set and costume design. He worked with Lubitsch, he worked with E.A. Dupont. He worked, sometimes co-directed films. He worked on Patience, 1920, Backstairs, 1921. He did an unusual series of short films, the Rebus films, kind of like little puzzle films. But his main sort of drive and influence was as this figurehead of theatre expressionism coming into film. I'd like to read you a little bit of Henri Langlois' appreciation of Leni and his importance. He says, he seems to have prefigured the realism of the 1930s, and although he was associated with Jesner in the cinematic transposition of the realistic play Backstairs, Leni's name is firmly linked in the history of the cinema with the expressionism for which he was the last bastion, both in Germany and then later in America. His personality as a filmmaker was established in 1924 with Waxworks, which at this time seemed to renew the art of Caligari, but was later seen to have closed it alongside other films, Galen's Student of Prague. He closed the era of romantic fantasy and horror. We'll come back to that description, romantic fantasy and horror. After his German years, Leni was, as it were, poached by the American system, by the Hollywood system, and there he made, between 1927 and 1929, The Cat and the Canary, The Chinese Parrot, The Man Who Laughs, a film that is often quoted, for instance, in Brian De Palma's film, The Black Dahlia. And his final film was The Last Warning. Now, Langlois stresses the role that Leni had as a theorist on the art of direction, as a designer for both stage and film. Leni exercised a considerable latent influence on German cinema, and that was why UFA entrusted him with the direction of Waxworks. In fact, from 1919, Leni had been, alongside the scriptwriter Karl Mayer, a veritable éminence grise to the German cinema. Now, Langlois insists on what he refers to as a method of pre-direction in German cinema. In other words, films that were so completely mapped out, sort of visually pre-conceptualised before the shooting. A method of pre-direction which enabled filmmakers to visualise a film before shooting. Under Murnau or Fritz Lang, teamwork does not modify the character of their films, but it can be a different matter when the dominant personality is no longer the director. So he says that on films on which Leni worked, he is the dominant personality. All the more so in that, as we have seen, he was more than just a designer. He had influence over sets, acting style, lighting, stage business. So that is a big influence indeed. Now, you'll sometimes read references to Leni that he was a modest person, unassuming person, and that even once he had directed films, he was still happy to take roles as a designer, a production designer, and so on. There's sort of another version or another variation on that in Elsas's book, where he prefers to see Leni, or to speculate that this is what he writes. By studying Leni's career as one of the outstanding set designers turned director, one arrives at a good sense of the professional exchanges that took place in Berlin between the various crafts and trades concerned with the graphic arts, including newspaper cartoons, the stage, cabaret design and poster art. This world allowed not only Leni to move with relative ease and substantial financial rewards between different kinds of professions and tasks, including directing. So direction was just one of the possible things to do in a general artistic and industrial career. Leni's career shows just how eclectic and opportunist, how tongue-in-cheek and playful, iconoclast and sarcastic the visual arts scene and film world were in the early 1920s, as the German cinema tried to build up a domestic market share and an internationally competitive industry. Many of the film architects, costume makers and set designers were just as likely to frequent Dadaist circles and cabarets in their spare time as to attend Expressionist gallery evenings. So there we have the suggestion that Leni was a new kind of artistic and cultural worker, and Elsesser is very keen to connect this to the whole industrial world that connects popular design, fashion, comics, cartoons, newspaper production. So it's not a pure question of the art of film. It's something sort of more promiscuous across the media, the different media, and the different technologies. Now, I've mentioned before the line of film historians of horror cinema and horror and fantasy. And one of the key figures in the writing of that kind of film history was Carlos Clarins, Cuban-born film critic, very sophisticated guy. And Paul Leni was someone that he wrote about in Richard Roud's book on the cinema, A Critical Dictionary. And this is what Clarins says. Like Kristen Thompson and her definition of expressionism, Clarins insists that Leni was like a total film artist, even when in Hollywood he could only be, of course, the credited director. He was no longer doing the set design, and he was no longer dealing with, as it were, German expressionist actors, but he nonetheless managed to bend everything to his vision. And this is what Clarins says: succeeding where D.W. Griffith and others failed, Leni established an archetypal mixture of grotesquerie and menace for James Whale, Todd Browning and Roman Polanski to follow. For all the comedy relief in his work, there is a real, if intangible, evil lurking in the Gothic recesses of Leni's abandoned mansions and theatres, a core of metaphysical angst retained in the context of summer stock material. So, of course, what you get there is a very good example of what I mentioned before, that sort of faced with the mixture of comedy and horror elements, comedy, romantic fantasy, horror, gothic, faced with that sort of combination, any viewer, any critic, any historian can stress one or other of those aspects, and Clarins chooses to stress the gothic aspect, the metaphysical angst. So he's very much in the line of Siegfried Kracauer there, and a certain aspect of Lotte Eisner's work, of stressing the haunted screen, the spectres of history, the reverberations of the grim 20th century world history. Now, this brings us back to the overall interpretations of this film, Waxworks. And I want to return now to the guts of what Siegfried Kracauer wrote about the film. So he puts this film, Waxworks, in a line with other films, including the first Dr. Mabuse film by Fritz Lang, and others which he calls the imaginary tyrant films, And it's very much based on this idea that after World War I, a very unsettled period for Germany and for the collective imagination of the German people. They were plunged into a kind of social chaos, confusion, and then, unfortunately, only a tyrant could save them, as it were. And of course, that was Hitler in history. So this is a little bit of something of the thesis of Kracauer, his overall approach in his book. So he says, the cycle of imaginary tyrant films came to a close with Waxworks. Released as late as November 1924, at a time when life was just beginning to look normal again, Waxworks marked the end of that period in which the harassed German mind retreated into a shell. The script was written by Henrik Galeen, who in Nosferatu had identified the tyrant with pestilence. He peopled the new film with no less than 3 tyrants, but reduced them all to wax figures. And then after going through a sort of a commentary on each episode, some of that I've quoted already, he says, the 3 episodes seize upon types of tyrants haunting a bygone period and also haunting former films. Jack the Ripper originates in the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, the Harun episode recalls Lubitsch's Sumerun, and Ivan the Terrible is an offspring of both the Caligari and the Lubitsch sphere, which is an intriguing way to think of the Ivan story. Krakauer goes on, however, since dreams, as a rule, bear on the dreamer's current plight, the dream character of the Jack the Ripper episode arouses the suspicion that Jack and his confreres are not merely figures of the past, but tyrants still among us. And he goes on to say that Waxworks culminates in scenes which, exceeding their task of illustrating the plot, penetrate the nature of tyrannical power. The insistence with which during those years pictorial imagination reverted to this subject indicates that the problem of absolute authority was an intrinsic concern of the collective mind. So very much Krakauer, and like Jim Hoberman today, sort of very much relies on this idea of a collective mind, of a collective consciousness of the film-going audience and of the society which is working through its fears and troubles. Now, very much, and Elsa discusses this, Krakauer, it's a kind of a dream analysis, a collective dream analysis. And because of that, he uses what Freud called displacements, that even though Jack the Ripper is a sort of legendary figure of the past, nonetheless he stands for the anxieties of the present day audience that's watching Waxworks in 1924. However, when you go into Krakauer's analysis, the sort of stranger it looks, because if we look at the figures in the film, Harun al-Rashid is a leader. Sure, he's a tyrant, but he's a very comic tyrant. Ivan the Terrible, sure, absolutely, he is the tyrant of Krakauer's description. Jack the Ripper, of course, is no kind of tyrant at all. He's just a killer. And if they had have made the other episode, the Rinaldo Rinaldini sort of Robin Hood episode, there you in fact have a hero of the people, not a tyrannical leader at all. So Krakauer is kind of forcing the question a little bit here by making everything in the film express tyranny, or express what he's referring to as the sort of chaotic emotions of the mind which is scared of a possible tyranny in society. And so there's a bit of a forcing of the analysis there, I feel. Now, absolutely sort of by contrast, let me translate for you what Jacques Loussel says about this film, Waxworks, in his book, his Dictionary of Cinema. He begins by quoting Georges Sadoul, the celebrated film historian, that Waxworks is the swan song of Expressionism, and particularly of Expressionism in film. Loussel says, this song is virtually a parody, a mocking, highly virtuosic satire of Expressionism, and especially of the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, from which it takes one of its principal sites, the funfair, and a part of its title. To ignore the comical dimension of this film would be to do it a grave injustice. I agree with Loussel on this. He goes on. This is particularly clear in the first story, the most characteristic and the most achieved, completely different to Krakauer's evaluation. This little tale of the 1001 Nights, carefully and amusingly enclosed in sets full of cavities, cupolas and threatening staircases where characters can only circulate while stooping and contorting themselves, adopting every kind of grotesque position. The same goes for the second episode, which evokes Tsar Ivan as a poor madman, certainly formidable, but more inspiring of pity than terror, and whose obsessions transform him ultimately into a puppet, mechanically repeating his gestures. So the literal machine man device of Ivan that we saw in the framing story sort of becomes the actual fate, the destiny of Ivan. And let me add here, this is not Loussel, that another important aspect of the Ivan episode in the film is that once again there's this sort of play with bodies and body substitution and a body and its copy, because he makes the father of the bride dress as himself, which of course leads to the poor guy's death. So here we have another play of the original and the copy, and another variation in the long list of variations that I think the film plays. Let's return to Loussel's account of the film. He says, "The final episode, which we'll get to soon, satirises the dreamlike aspect of Expressionism. This chaos of forms, as Lotte Eisner described it, is an unformed heap more than a multiform. It combines superimpositions, camera movements, unusual angles. It ends up denying all space and concludes with a great roar of saving laughter, the particular tie-up of film and the history of Expressionism." For Leni, Expressionism is no more here than the occasion to chisel some little decorative, sophisticated nightmares. You'll remember Lotte Eisner's idea of decorative Expressionism. So he chisels some little decorative, sophisticated nightmares where terror and humour mix in a talented equilibrium. It is clearly that very talent which the Americans recognised in Leni when they hired him to come work for them in the United States, where he perfected a trilogy of half-horrific, half-humorous entertainments, The Cat and the Canary, Chinese Parrot, and especially The Last Warning, that created a new genre. So there, in Loussel's account, he says, yes, there's horror and there's comedy, but the stress he puts is on the comic aspect, the satirical aspect, the mocking aspect. This is something Elsässer also underlines, that sort of coming at the end of a cycle of a fad, we could call it, the Expressionist fad. This film, Waxworks, is more open to that possibility of a game playing irony, mockery, satire. So we shouldn't take the film so easily, so quickly as the mirror of a tormented soul, as Clarens, out of many others, tends to do. Now, I dare to say here that many of the best writers on Expressionist cinema often get to this point where, they've seen all the films many times, and the films kind of form a whole crowd, a mass, and often things tend to leak from one film to another, and this affects what they say about each individual film. I think that's true of Krakauer, that he has this image of the tyrants and of the chaos, and that tends to inform every single Expressionist film that he's talking about. Even in the case of Thomas Elsässer, he has a sophisticated interpretation in his book on Weimar cinema of this film Waxworks, where he says it is basically like Calgary, like The Golem, like other films in the cycle. He says it's a film about male figures, particularly sort of father figures, and he says that in each part of Waxworks there's like a good father and a bad father who do contest, and it's a question of, in Elsässer's interpretation, it's a question of the class position of the poet who must win the favour of the father in order to be allowed to have the hand of the daughter, and that this problem of the poet is sort of mirrored and resolved across the different stories. Now, that too, just like what Krakauer did, I think that's sort of forcing the film a bit, because there is no intrigue in the film involving the girl's father in the Waxworks booth. He simply comes in, says, "You want a job?" to the poet, kind of disappears, and that's about it. There is no intrigue around the father and his daughter and the possible suitor for her. And similarly, some of the details that Elsässer sort of projects into each episode are not entirely there, or they're not exactly the way that he sees them. So, for instance, in the first story, the Caliph story, of course, we have a much more comical idea of a kind of bad, lousy father, leader, tyrant figure, the Caliph himself, but who sort of reluctantly turns into a good guy at the end of the story. But even him turning into a good guy is a satirical, ironic moment in the film. So doubtless we can network this film Waxworks with all the other expressionist films, and we can start to draw out certain commonalities and certain recurring themes. But as I'm warning, we shouldn't let that sort of overdetermine or overpower how we see the particular films. Let me pick up again here a quotation of Leni himself talking about his aims and how he saw the translation of the expressionist ideal into cinema. He said, "I may perhaps cite the example of Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and The Golem, in which Hans Perlzig created a town's image." So didn't merely photograph a town, he created the image of a town, the expressionist image of a town. Leni goes on, "I cannot stress too strongly how important it is for a designer to shun the world seen every day and to attain its true sinews. It will be seen that a designer must not construct fine sets. He must penetrate the surface of things and reach their heart. He must create mood, even though he has to safeguard his independence with regard to the object seen merely through everyday eyes. It is this which makes him an artist. Otherwise, I can see no reason why he should not be replaced by an adroit apprentice carpenter." So you get a good idea there of Leni's estimation of his own craft and his own art, and of this particular will towards stylisation. Now, yet another aspect of these themes that I've been proposing of life and death, of life and its double, of doubling a waxwork with a story, a waxwork becoming a human, this realm of the uncanny I'm talking about. In many ways, this story of Ivan the Terrible, as told in this film and in this episode, is of course the story of someone who has absolute control over life, who reduces life, and particularly death, to a mechanism. There is this poison, the poison mixer, quite an artist, that guy, can obviously calculate the exact moment of death, which is then timed to, the sands in the glass, in the hourglass. Absolutely incredible, wonderful concept. Gruesome, as Krakauer says. The Marquis de Sade would have been proud of this idea, of this invention. So we have the notion of, once again, sort of turning humans into machines, in the sense that you can exactly control the moment of their death. So it's control of life to the point of death. And so Ivan is another variation on this theme of, bringing a figure to life in a story, and also bringing a figure to death by the means of poison, of magic, of whatever it may be, of the strange technology of the hourglass. Now, Conrad Veidt, another great star, great actor, who eventually, of course, went to Hollywood. He's superb, and superbly expressionist. I mean, expressionist acting. Too often someone who's new to watching an expressionist film can say, "God, what over the top acting!" But of course, this kind of outsized, very highly expressive acting is what expressionism is literally all about. Now, this is fantastic what Conrad Veidt does in this scene, and this wonderful shot, this kind of long take of him, because he's losing his mind. He's taken on the belief that he has been poisoned, and so he's trying to figure out, well, maybe if I can keep turning the hourglass, I will keep living. But then he's clearly becoming confused about, well, what is the hourglass, up or down now? What do I do with it? So as the film's intertitles tell us, he turns it to the end of his days. So he gets locked into the hellish mechanical repetition. He becomes what else are referred to as the machine man. So here we have like a grimly ironic story, whereas the first story of the Caliph sort of ends with a comic irony. This one ends really in a black comic irony, really, where, as Loussel and others have indicated, there's almost a note of pity. So now we're about to launch into the finale of the film. The Jack the Ripper sequence is a bravura scene, and in fact Krakauer called it, he said, it must be counted among the greatest achievements of film art, which is a big claim. It's very important to note here we enter, as I mentioned before, the realm of dreaming, and of course the Freudian psychoanalytic realm, sleeping, dreaming. So we have a series of shots that kind of underline this question of tiredness, of sleeping and dreaming, of particularly the two main characters here, of the poet and the daughter of the proprietor. Now here's something that I previewed before, which is that the final horror of the film doesn't really have much to do at all with the legend of Jack the Ripper or any details of it. In fact, Jack the Ripper is just pure killer in this scene. It's like a preview of the stalker slasher genre. I mean, he does nothing. His only function is to kill. And what's important to me is that Leni stresses in these shots we're watching now this sort of vision, so blurred eyesight. And in many ways, it's the blurring of vision that leads to the particular monstrous, horrific character of the sequence that is about to begin, which is the dream sequence, once he's slipped into the dream. And here, the waxwork comes alive through the passage into the dream world. Let me read you what Krakauer, his particular way of describing this. He says that this scene expresses what he's talking about, the notion of chaos. He says disparate architectural fragments from pell-mell complexes, doors open of their own accord, and all proportions and relations depart from the normal. He says the images symbolise the interpenetration of chaos and tyranny in a definite manner, and Waxworks adds the final touch to the tyrant film cycle. Now what's fantastic is to look at the techniques of this scene, because a lot of it has to do with the superimposition of the same shot, the same place, the same angle, but once with the actors in it and once with the actors not in it. So that we'll see a door, but we'll also see the door open, as it were, on top of the door. And there are these slightly misaligned superimpositions as well. So this kind of backs up my idea that, in a way, what we have here is a sort of phantasmagoria of the media, of photography and cinematography itself, as this new machine or this new apparatus of vision becomes the stuff of nightmares. And everything about this sequence is so fantastically cinematic, but it's almost like a nightmare of cinema itself. Jump cuts, strange displacements of scale and of direction and of perspective. You know, the nothing is real type coordinates that Krakauer underlined, where there's no meaningful flight or chase, there's no meaningful pursuit or escape, because there's no real space anymore. There are only, as it were, these expressions of mood, which, as we just saw, can so easily sort of, start to crack these very fragile positions of feeling at peace, or feeling light, feeling at home, feeling on solid ground, can very quickly be sort of literally cracked apart by the images. And of course, the ending of this dream is not happy at all, in that it leads to the death of the poet. Elsass sees in the connection here that when we return to the frame story, It's like, he's, as it were, stabbed himself, or touched himself at least, with his pen. And Elsasser reads there the sort of social background of the fight of cinema and the high arts, the fine arts of literature, say. Cinema versus literature, cinema versus the classical theatre and music. Whereas, of course, Waxworks itself, like the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, by being situated in a fairground, in a fun park, circus atmosphere, is necessarily aligning itself with the popular arts. And indeed, in a lot of the German films of this period, we can see this kind of drama playing itself out under the surface, this sort of tension between the higher arts and the popular arts. And Waxworks, across its different phases, its different episodes, is also working with that. So we arrive at a happy ending. As Krakauer said, to round out the framing story, the film concludes with the heartening intimation that the poet and the girl please each other. But it's also this sort of farewell to Expressionism. Remember that Werner Krauss, who has appeared briefly as Jack the Ripper, was in fact Caligari himself in the cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And so that kind of menace, which of course is referred to here in the poet's look at the waxwork, but now, as it were, the waxwork is completely inanimate and lifeless, and the uncanny tremors can come to an end.